Stand on Marshall Street in Holbeck, on the industrial southern edge of Leeds, and look up at the building that faces you. It is a strange thing to find in a Yorkshire mill district. The front is cut from pale sandstone, and it does not behave the way the frontage of a factory is supposed to behave. The columns splay very slightly outward as they descend, leaning into the ground the way the walls of a real Egyptian temple lean, a deliberate taper the architects called a batter. Above them a heavy cornice curls outward and over, rolling forward like the lip of an unrolled papyrus scroll. And there, holding position directly above the entrance where an ordinary company would have hung a painted sign with its own name on it, are two carved winged sun discs, wings spread wide across the stone, exactly as they would sit above the doorway of a shrine on the far side of the Mediterranean. 18 tall windows run the width of the facade, each one separated from the next by a column crowned with a bundled papyrus bud. It is, in every visible detail, the front of a temple to an Egyptian god. It was, in fact, a flax mill. This is Temple Works, and to understand how a working textile factory in the West Riding came to wear the face of the Temple of Horus, you have to walk back through the whole 19th century to the men who built it, and to the single obstinate ambition that drove them. Start with the building itself because it is the most complete surviving statement of that ambition. Temple Works was raised between 1836 and 1840 for the firm of John Marshall and Company. It is what architectural historians file under the Egyptian Revival style, and it does two very different things at once. At the front stands a multi-storey office and entrance block, and that is the piece you can read from the street, the piece with the columns and the cornice and the winged discs, the piece modelled on a genuine temple pylon front. Behind that block running back into the site sits something else entirely. A single-storey shed, low and flat-roofed, covering roughly 2 acres of ground in one continuous span. That was the working heart of the place, the spinning and weaving hall, and its design borrowed not from the tall gateway temples, but from the lower, flatter birthhouse buildings, the ones set within the great temple precincts. The two halves together, the vertical ceremonial mask and the vast horizontal factory floor behind it, make up one of the most peculiar industrial buildings anywhere in Britain. It is also one of the most protected. Temple Works is listed at Grade 1, the highest tier of legal protection England grants a building, a category that covers only about 2.5% of all listed structures in the country. Cathedrals sit in that band. Great country houses sit in that band. And of every listed building in the whole of Holbeck, Temple Works is the only one to reach it. That is worth holding on to, because for long stretches of the story that follows this same building would stand empty, dripping, half-collapsed and sold for the price of a cup of tea. But the stone front never stopped being extraordinary, and the people who assessed it never stopped agreeing on that. Now the man whose name is on the company. John Marshall was born on the 27th of July 1765, in the middle of Leeds, at number 1 Briggate. His father, Jeremiah Marshall, was a linen draper, a seller of cloth, and the boy grew up around the trade in woven flax that would define the rest of his life. It was not a grand start, but it was a solid one, a respectable commercial family in a growing manufacturing town. When Jeremiah died in 1787, the young John Marshall inherited the drapery business and an estate valued at around £9,000. That was real money for the time, enough to matter, though nothing close to the fortune it would eventually become. Marshall was in his early 20s, he had capital in his hands, and he had an idea about where the trade in linen was heading. The idea was mechanisation. Cotton spinning had already been transformed by machinery in the preceding decades, the great water-powered and later steam-powered spinning frames that were remaking Lancashire. Flax, the plant that linen is made from, was tougher, stringier, harder to spin by machine, and it had lagged behind. Marshall set out to close that gap. In 1788 he leased Scotland Mill at Adel, on the northern outskirts of Leeds, and he brought in an engineer to help him solve the mechanical problem. That engineer was Matthew Murray, one of the finest mechanical minds of the age, and the partnership between the merchant with the money and the engineer with the hands proved decisive. Together they adapted cotton spinning machinery to the awkward business of spinning flax into linen yarn, and it worked. From there the growth was relentless. Marshall moved his operation down onto the Holbeck, the stream that gives Holbeck its name, and began building mills along it from 1791 onward, a whole succession of them raised over the following decades. He powered them first with water and then with steam. He drove the spindle count up, and the numbers tell the story better than any adjective could. By 1803, John Marshall and Company was the largest flax spinning business in Britain. A draper's son with a £9,000 inheritance had, inside a decade and a half, built the biggest firm of its kind in the country. In time, his Holbeck mills would run some 7,000 spindles between them and employ around 2,000 people, an industrial town in miniature packed into a few streets south of the river. Marshall himself became exactly the sort of figure that kind of success produces. He grew immensely wealthy. He moved in the reforming, improving circles of his age, a man with interest beyond the mill floor, and in 1826 he was elected to Parliament as a member for the town, sitting into the following year. He bought land in the Lake District and built a life away from the noise of Holbeck. But the firm on the Holbeck remained the source of everything, and the firm kept needing more room. That is the pressure that produced Temple Works. By the 1830s, Marshall himself was an old man, in his late 60s and then his 70s, no longer the hands-on driver he had been. The daily running of the manufacturing had passed increasingly to his sons, and one of them in particular, James Garth Marshall, took charge of the works. It was this younger generation, managing a business their father had spent 50 years building, who faced a specific and practical problem. The existing Holbeck complex was a stack of tall multi-storey mills, floor piled on floor, and buildings like that had two chronic weaknesses. They were dangerous, because a fire that started on a lower floor of a timber and iron mill full of dry, oily fibre could race upward and gut the whole structure. And they were awkward, because moving material and machinery up and down through many stories wasted time and effort that a single continuous floor would not. So the Marshall sons began to think about a different kind of building altogether. Not another tower, a single vast room, all on one level, fireproof in its construction, lit from above rather than from windows in the side walls, big enough to hold an entire production process end to end without a staircase in sight. It was to be the last mill the family would ever build, and it was meant to be the greatest, a final statement that would outdo not only every mill they had raised before, but anything their competitors could show. A firm that had been the largest of its kind in the country for a generation was not going to build something ordinary to crown the achievement. But a single-storey room 2 acres across is an engineering challenge as much as an architectural one. You have to roof it. You have to light it, since a room that wide cannot rely on windows in distant outer walls to reach its centre. You have to hold the temperature and, crucially for flax, the moisture at the right levels across the whole floor, because flax thread turns brittle and unworkable in dry air. You have to make it grand enough to satisfy a family that thought of this as its monument. The plainer, cheaper answer would have been a big, functional shed, and any number of Yorkshire firms would have stopped there. The Marshalls did not want a shed. They wanted the largest room in the world, and they wanted it to look like nothing else in Leeds, or in England, or anywhere the men of Holbeck had ever seen. So in 1836, needing one last mill greater than any that came before it, John Marshall's sons looked for their model not in Leeds, but 2,000 miles away, along the Nile. So in 1836, needing one last mill greater than any that came before it, John Marshall's sons looked for their model not in Leeds, but 2,000 miles away, along the Nile. The old man himself was past 70 by then, and it was really his son, James Garth Marshall, who drove the day-to-day business of it, who would go on to run the manufacturing floor. But the ambition was the family's ambition, 40 years in the making. They had begun as linen drapers. They had ended as the largest flax spinners in the country. And for the building that would hold their final and grandest works, they wanted something that no rival could match, and no visitor could forget. They did not want another tall brick mill of the sort already crowding the banks of the Holbeck. They wanted a temple. To build it, they assembled a small and unusual team. At the centre stood Joseph Bonomi the Younger, born in 1796, a British sculptor, draftsman and Egyptologist, who had spent years in Egypt itself, drawing the monuments at first hand, measuring them, living among their ruins. He was not a man who had merely read about the temples of the Nile. He had stood inside them. That direct knowledge, combined with sketches made specifically for this commission, is what he brought back to Yorkshire. Working beside him was James Combe, the structural engineer, a former pupil of the great civil engineer John Rennie. Where Bonomi supplied the archaeology, Combe supplied the mathematics, the cast iron, and the physics of holding a 2-acre roof aloft over a working factory floor. And credited alongside them was David Roberts, born the same year as Bonomi, the the Scottish painter who would later become famous across Europe for his lithographs of Egypt and the Holy Land. Between the three of them, they carried the real Egypt, sketched and remembered, home to Holbeck. The building they produce still puzzles anyone who walks up Marshall Street for the first time, because the first thing the eye registers is that something is wrong. The proportions do not read as a factory. The stone office and entrance block at the front presents a long facade of 18 full-height windows, each divided from the next by columns crowned with capitals shaped like the bud of the papyrus plant. Over the top of the whole front runs a heavy overhanging cornice that curls outward like the edge of a rolled scroll, the shape the Egyptians called a cavetto. Above the entrance itself sit two carved winged sun discs, holding their position, where an ordinary Leeds mill would simply have painted the company name. Even the walls lean. They splay gently outward as they descend to the ground, the deliberate inward slope that real Egyptian temple walls carry, an effect the builders call a batter. That front block is the part most often traced to the Temple of Horus at Edfu, one of the best preserved temples in all of Egypt, and Edfu is the name that gets repeated most in the popular retellings. But the front block is only the overture. Behind it stretches the thing the building was actually built to do, the single-storey works hall, low and flat-roofed, spreading back across the site. And that low hall was drawn from a different source. The more careful architectural accounts trace it not to Edfu but to the temple complex at Dendera, and specifically to the low, flat, self-contained buildings there that the Egyptians used as mammisi, or birthhouses. So the popular shorthand that temple works is simply a copy of Edfu is not quite right. It is really two temples fused into one industrial machine, the pylon front of Edfu bolted to the low sanctuaries of Dendera, the whole of it translated into millstone grit and cast iron, and set down in a Yorkshire textile district. What that low hall contained, when it was finished, was something contemporaries struggled to describe without reaching for superlatives. Roughly 2 acres of unbroken floor, no dividing walls, no internal stories, nothing to break the eye from one end to the other. On its completion, the mill's spinning and weaving hall was described quite simply as the largest room in the world. To spread 2 acres of factory under a single roof and still fill it with daylight was the central engineering problem, and Combs' solution is what gives the interior its strange cathedral quality. The flat roof was punctured by ranks of conical glass skylights, cones of glass rising up out of the roof surface. There were around 60 of them, though some accounts push the figure as high as 66, and the exact count has never quite settled. Each cone measured about 14 feet across at its base, and rose roughly 10 feet above the line of the roof. Standing on the floor below, a worker looked up into a field of grey northern light, 60 soft circles of it, each pouring down its own pool of daylight onto the rows of spinning frames, the whole ceiling brightening and dimming as the clouds moved over Leeds. Under that light the machinery ran on steam. The power came from a single enormous engine, a double-beam steam engine of 240 horsepower, built by the Bolton firm of B. Hick & Sons and installed in 1840. It turned at about 19 revolutions a minute and drove a flywheel roughly 26 feet across, close to 8 meters, a wheel taller than 3 men standing on each other's shoulders, spinning steadily somewhere below the working floor. From that one wheel the motion was distributed out across the whole 2 acres to the 7,000 spindles that Marshall's Holbeck mills eventually turned. And there was one more piece of quiet cleverness woven through the hall, a detail that captures the whole spirit of the place. The interior was studded with cast iron columns, and those columns too were dressed as papyrus, moulded with the swelling bud capitals to carry the Egyptian theme all the way inside. But they were not simply decoration, and they were not, despite appearances, the main structural props holding up the roof. They were plumbing. Each of those ornamental Egyptian columns was hollow and doubled as a disguised downpipe, carrying rainwater from the vast roof above down and away, without a single visible drainpipe anywhere to spoil the temple illusion. The building drained itself through its own hieroglyphic forest. It is worth remembering, when we come to 2008, that it was the failure of one cast iron member, a snapped tensioning rod, that finally brought part of that roof down. But in 1840 the system was a marvel. Water and daylight and steam, all routed invisibly through the fabric of a temple. Life inside this machine was arranged with the same deliberate completeness. The engines and boilers, with their heat and their fire risk, were kept out of the main hall entirely and set below it, in an undercroft beneath the working floor. That undercroft did the dirty, dangerous work out of sight, but it held more than machinery. Down there, alongside the beam engine and the boilers, the marshals provided a school and a nursery for the children of the workforce, and kept an on-site doctor. These were welfare provisions genuinely unusual for their time, part of the family's wider reputation, paternalistic though it was, for an interest in factory reform. So the undercroft carried two soundscapes layered against each other behind brick partitions. On one side, the thud and hiss of the beam engine doing its invisible work, and on the other, only yards away, the ordinary daytime noise of small children, voices and lessons, in a space built above all to keep the looms turning upstairs. Above them, on the floor, the numbers were vast for the age. Marshall's Holbeck mills together employed something like 2,000 workers and turned around 7,000 spindles, and the air those workers breathed was itself engineered. It was kept deliberately, insistently humid because flax thread has a flaw. Let it dry out and it turns brittle, snapping and fraying and becoming unmanageable on the frames. A damp atmosphere was not a comfort for the workforce, it was a production requirement. So the hall was kept moist and close, thick with the vegetal, oily smell of processed flax fibre and warm machine grease, under the endless low rumble and clack of thousands of spindles feeding off that one great flywheel below. That vast concentration of workers also placed Temple works squarely inside the great labour unrest of the period. In August 1842, the plug plot riots swept across the industrial districts of Lancashire and Yorkshire, a wave of general strikes and factory disturbances in which crowds moved from mill to mill and knocked the plugs out of the steam boilers, draining them so the engines could not run and the works were forced to stop. Marshall's Holbeck mills, Temple works among them, were caught up in it, targeted by the rioters at the gates. Barely 2 years old, the Temple had already felt the pressure of the industrial world it belonged to. And then there is the roof, the detail that carries the whole strange legend of the place. That great flat expanse over the 2-acre hall was not left as bare stone or lead. It was built up with a bed of soil and covered in real turf, and kept as living grass. This too came back to the humidity. The layer of earth and growing grass helped hold the damp in the air of the works below, and steadied the temperature, keeping the flax thread supple. It was a green field laid over a spinning shed. But grass grows, and a field of grass on a factory roof would soon go rank and ragged, and so the marshals solved that in the most literal way imaginable. They put sheep on the roof. Sheep were kept up there to graze the grass down and keep it cropped. An incongruous patch of Yorkshire pasture balanced directly over an Egyptian engine hall, animals chewing quietly above the roar of 240 horsepower. The sheep, however, presented one final problem, and its solution is the thing everybody remembers. Sheep, it is said, will readily climb a flight of stairs, but they will not reliably walk back down one. Having got them up onto the roof, you could not simply send them down again the way they came, and so the engineers built a lift. What multiple accounts describe as the world's first hydraulic lift, built specifically to carry sheep, was installed to raise the animals up to the grass and lower them safely down again. An early and thoroughly eccentric use of hydraulic technology, decades before such lifts became ordinary for carrying people. The details vary in the retelling: who exactly built it, precisely how it worked, whether it truly was the first of its kind in the entire world. An honest history should treat the world first claim as a much-repeated story rather than a proven fact. But the core of it is well attested and entirely in keeping with everything else about the building. Here was a factory disguised as the temple of an Egyptian god, draining itself through hollow papyrus columns, lit by 60 cones of glass, cooled and humidified by a meadow on its roof, and served by a hydraulic lift whose passengers were sheep. For a while it all worked exactly as intended. This was the high water mark, the temple complete and the machinery new, the daylight pouring through the glass and the great flywheel turning below, and the grass growing green overhead. The great engine ran at full stretch through the 1840s and 1850s, but from the 1870s the orders thinned, the profits turned to losses, and the largest room in the world began, quietly, to empty. The great engine ran at full stretch through the 1840s and 1850s, but from the 1870s the orders thinned, the profits turned to losses, and the largest room in the world began, quietly, to empty. It didn't happen in a single dramatic season. It happened the way most industrial declines happen, one slow year at a time, as the flax trade that had made John Marshall the richest spinner in Britain drifted toward cheaper competition, changing fashions in cloth, and rivals who had learned every trick the family once kept to itself. The firm that had built a temple to its own confidence found that confidence harder and harder to justify against the ledger. By the end, the numbers told a blunt story. In the final 40 years of the business, Marshall and Coaster lost money in 21 of them. More than half the time, the great mill on Marshall Street was running at a loss. The family did what struggling firms have always done. They looked for ways to spread the cost of a building that had been designed for abundance and now sat too large for the work it was given. They began to sublet parts of the mill, letting out corners of that vast weaving hall to other trades, other tenants, other machines that had nothing to do with linen thread. A temple built for one grand purpose was quietly parcelled out, room by room, to whoever would pay to stand inside it. And then, in 1886, it stopped. Marshall & Co.'s closed. The firm that had begun with a teenage draper and a £9,000 inheritance, that had grown into the largest flax spinning business in the country, that had put sheep on a roof and glass domes across 2 acres of Yorkshire sky, dissolved into the past tense. The spindles fell silent. The humid, engineered air the whole building had been designed to hold was allowed, at last, to dry. But a building like this does not simply vanish when its first owners leave. It is too big, too strange, too solid. So Temple Works did what large industrial buildings do when their original reason for being disappears. It became useful in ordinary, unglamorous ways. Over the decades that followed, the mill passed through a long procession of commercial and industrial tenants, each of them treating a replica Egyptian temple as simply floor space, square footage to be filled. It stored things. It housed businesses that never gave a second thought to the winged sun discs above the door. In the 1970s, the great hall that had once spun linen for the world served as a mail-order warehouse for the retailer K's, its aisles of shelving standing where the flax frames used to run, orders and parcels moving under the same conical skylights that had once lit 2,000 workers at their machines. There were flickers of larger ambition along the way. In 2005, a planning application proposed turning the site into something new, a mixture of retail units, offices and flats, the kind of conversion that has rescued so many old mills across the north of England. On paper, it was a plausible future. In practice, it did not proceed. The scheme stalled, the plans were set aside, and the building went on waiting, half-used and increasingly unloved, for someone to work out what a Grade 1 listed Egyptian temple was actually for in the 21st century. The answer very nearly became nothing at all. The most dangerous moment in the building's long afterlife came in December 2008. Deep in the structure of that vast roof, one of the cast-iron tensioning rods that helped hold the whole system in balance failed. It snapped, and when it went, it took a section of the building with it. A pillar gave way, and part of the roof came down, the sudden crack and crash breaking a silence that had settled over the hall for years. The largest room in the world, already empty, already fragile, was now visibly, structurally at risk. This was no longer a question of finding a tenant. It was a question of whether the building would survive at all. For a while, it looked as though it might not. Temple Works sat vacant and vulnerable, water finding its way in. The damage from the collapse an open wound in a listed structure. The Victorian Society, which keeps a grim annual watch over the country's most threatened historic buildings, placed Temple Works among the 10 most endangered buildings in England and Wales. That is the register of last resort, the list a building lands on when the real possibility on the table is demolition or ruin. A structure that had once been described as one of the wonders of industrial Leeds was now, officially, one of the most at-risk buildings in the nation. Hope arrived and then evaporated. In 2015, the fashion house Burberry announced that it wanted to bring manufacturing to the site, a scheme that would have put skilled work back inside the old mill and paid for its repair. It was, briefly, exactly the kind of rescue the building needed. But in 2017, in the uncertain aftermath of the Brexit referendum, Burberry abandoned the plan, and so, later that same year, Temple Works reached the strangest milestone in its whole history. It went to public auction with a guide price of £1. £1, a single coin for a Grade 1 listed building, for a replica Egyptian temple, for the site of the largest single room ever built. The price was not a joke, and it was not quite real. It was a measure of fear. The £1 guide reflected the sheer scale of the liability that came attached, the millions upon millions of pounds of restoration that any buyer would be signing up to carry. You were not really being offered a building for £1. You were being offered a very large, very beautiful, very broken responsibility, and the pound was simply the door you had to walk through to take it on. The buyer who walked through it was the property developer CEG. That purchase, in 2017, is the hinge on which the whole modern story turns. Because CEG did not treat Temple Works as a pound coin bargain to be flipped. They treated it as a long-term project, and the numbers make clear just how long and how large. By 2019, CEG's own estimate put the full cost of restoring the building at more than £35 million. That is the true price the £1 guide had been hiding. Bringing a temple back from the edge of collapse, repairing a roof that had already failed once, stabilising cast iron and stone and glass across 2 acres was never going to be cheap. It was going to be one of the most expensive heritage rescues in the region. Money began to arrive in stages from more than one direction. In 2022, Temple Works received around £1 million from the government's Culture Recovery Fund, the emergency support programme set up to help cultural buildings survive. That million went into the essential early work, the make safe and repair that has to come before any grand vision. Part of that effort turned to the neighbour that stands beside the main mill, the Gate Lodge, a smaller Grade 2 listed structure that is part of the same site. From the spring of 2024, CEG's restoration team began repairing the Gate Lodge, mending the smaller building as a first visible sign that the whole site was at last being brought back to life rather than simply held together. And here the story stops being only about a building and starts being about what the building might become. Because CEG has not been restoring Temple Works into a vacuum. Working in partnership with the British Library and Leeds City Council, the plan is to turn this old flax mill into something with a national name, British Library North. The idea is to convert the site into a public hub of roughly 8,000 square metres, a place for learning, for research, for business incubation, for events and exhibitions. A second home, in the north of England, for one of the country's great libraries, set inside a Victorian temple to industry. It is a fitting kind of afterlife. A building raised on the confidence of the industrial age, reborn as a house of knowledge for the age that followed. That ambition has attracted serious public money, reported in stages and from more than one budget line. There has been a figure of around £25 million tied to the British Library North proposal, and around February 2025, a further £10 million was confirmed from central government, funding intended to help bring the Temple Works site into public ownership through the agency Homes England. These are large sums, layered on top of one another, the kind of committed backing that turns a hopeful plan into a probable one. The library, the council, the developer and the government are, between them, putting real weight behind the idea that a temple built for flax can become a temple for books. And yet, for all of that, the ending is not yet written. As of 2026, the project remains, in the honest phrase, still in progress. The funding streams are real, but they are still moving between agencies and authorities, the negotiations over ownership and money and timing still working themselves out. There is a budget. There is a partnership. There is a name. What there is not yet is a confirmed date on which the doors will open to the public. The building that has waited since 1886 to find its true second purpose is being asked to wait a little longer. So this is where the story leaves it, not as history, but as a present tense. Stand on Marshall Street today, and you will not see a finished library, and you will not see a ruin. You will see a building mid-rescue, wrapped and braced, half hidden by the apparatus of its own repair. And so in 2026, behind hoarding and scaffolding on Marshall Street in Holbeck, the papyrus columns and the 2-winged sun discs still hold their place above the door, waiting for a British Library North that has a budget but not yet an opening date.